Yeah.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Today, we're so privileged to have with us Dinitia Smith, who's the author of four novels: The Hard Rain, Remember This, The Illusionist, which was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and most recently, The Honeymoon. Her stories have appeared in numerous publications, including the Hudson Review. She's won a number of awards for her writing, including fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Ingram Merrill Foundation. Until recently, Smith was a cultural correspondent for the New York Times, specializing in literature and the arts. She's taught at Columbia University and New York University and currently lives in New York. And we're so privileged to have her here to discuss her latest book, The Prince. So thank you for the advance copy. And how are you, Denisha?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm very happy to be talking to you.
Thank you so much. So, without further ado, let's just jump into the interview. So, I just want to ask you, this is your fifth book. So, you've seen
Yes.
your fair share of literary success. So, do you feel experienced at your craft now, or do you feel like you're discovering it anew every single time?
Well, I might now have a shadow sense of what to do, but it's still pulling it out of yourself. It's never easy. It's probably one of the reasons I like doing it. That's not the only reason, but because it's so hard. And The Prince was not the hardest of my novels. By then, I had kind of gotten the idea of what a novel is. So it only took me probably a year and a half, a year maybe, which was very short for me. So I think that you have a point that it became more familiar to me.
Right. And you've previously worked on biographies, of course, contemporary fiction, queer fiction, short fiction, in various literary magazines. So, what made you want to retell an iconic story?
Um, I'm going to ask you to repeat the question, if you would. What was the question?
Yeah, so I said that you've dabbled in so many genres before. You've worked on biographies, on contemporary fiction, queer fiction, and short fiction, of course. So, what made you retell an iconic story?
What would I consider? What was the end of the sentence? Forgive
What
me for.
No, that's completely fine. What made you want to retell an iconic story? Your new book is a retelling of Henry James's story, right?
It is a retelling of Henry James' great novel, The Golden Bull. Probably it was his last complete novel, and always my favorite novel. It's
Right.
a novel. It's a novel about a family with secrets, terrible secrets, and how they confront them or deal with them. It's about a very wealthy American family, and my novel I called The Prince because the Henry James novel deals with an impoverished American prince who marries into an immensely wealthy American family, and he gains some money, and they gain a little royalty, the cachet of royalty. So I was interested in how this family dealt with these terrible secrets, how they managed to survive them in this milieu of immense privilege. And it's also about who the prince is, being royalty and yet having no money, and the sweet, beautiful girl he marries, the rich girl.
Yeah.
And then what happens?
Right. But Henry James's story is also a classic, right? So,
Oh,
what aspects of modernity did you add to the story, and what bits of the classicness, if you will, did you want to preserve?
this is actually the core question. Okay, the classic novel, Henry James' Golden Bull, I took the outlines of this story. I was interested in not only the question of family secrets, but how does as I said, the family deal with them, but also the issue of inherited wealth. In the United States, the first great wealth came from the Industrial Revolution, from what we call the robber barons who started the railroads, who dug the mines. They were rough people. They weren't particularly well educated. And their descendants inherited all this money, which grew and grew through investments. One example would be the Rockefeller family.
Yeah.
Now, they had huge wealth, but now in the 22nd century, how are their descendants dealing with this? The guilt that many of them feel about their predecessors. We have a new kind of wealth coming in to this country, and I'm sure in India, from the digital world, technology, immense wealth. And this is about the earlier wealth, 2 or 3, 4 generations beyond. So in my case, I took the robber baron category or character from Henry James, and I made him into a man who is living in this century, who knows how awful his antecedents were and tries to do good in his own way. He becomes a public interest lawyer. And so I was interested, and also the way that immense wealth shields people from the real world to some extent. They live in a bubble, as it could be called.
Yeah.
And that is part of this story, because the young woman whom the prince marries doesn't perceive the reality, the real world. Her father adores her. She adores him. He's a widower. And
Yeah.
she is sort of an innocent. And in some ways, my novel, as in Henry James, my novel, The Prince, is about her learning to see the real world.
Yeah. Okay, just a very cliche question, but I have to ask it anyway. What were some of the pitfalls and the, advantages, for the lack of a better word, of retelling a story rather than just writing it for the first time?
There are many pitfalls. I will tell you the major pitfalls. First of all, The Golden Bull is written in extremely complicated language.
Yeah.
Some people are afraid of it. I happen to love it, but I think the language is part of its greatness. I couldn't do that, didn't want to do that. My language is very straightforward. It's not slangish, but it's the only way I know how to write. So the major pitfall, I'm laughing because it is one, is to be compared to the original.
Yeah.
The original is, probably one of the great novels of the turn of the century, of the 21st century. So I had to wonder what on earth I was doing, honestly. And I became absorbed in it and kind of gave up that fear for the time being. But I knew that this was going to be a danger. And so far, not really yet, but we'll see. I dedicate it to him, to Henry James, the novel. And I say, I hope he will forgive me wherever he is.
I'm sure he will. I'm sure you've done justice to it.
Sure. We'll see. He was very tough on other authors. And this, I'm hardly in the same realm, but it is a wonderful story. The Prince, the one I tell, which is taken from The Golden Bull. It's a love story too.
Yeah.
It's also about the notion that love is blind, which is, love is the unknowable, or the mystery of the other person whose inner life you cannot see.
Right. So let's talk about the mood of the story. The cover that I just showed and the synopsis exude very dark, sinister vibes. So was this a conscious effort or did it happen organically?
You're talking about the way the prince has a darkness and how it unfolds and the structure.
Yeah.
I stole the structure from James. For example, James, the Golden Bowl opens with the marriage contract has been written. So I decided, it's alluded to in James, so I decided to show the scene in a lawyer's office, an attorney's office, where the marriage contract is being signed. And the prince, who he's not a bad person really, but he's aware in some part of himself that this marriage could be difficult, even though he loves this young woman.
Yeah.
And so I borrowed much of the structure from, that's really what I borrowed from James in the end for the prince. They go to this very grand club where the father belongs, and they talk, and they are, his doubts are sort of running in his unconscious or his consciousness, not in his language. Then all of a sudden, as in the Henry James novel and in The Prince, this beautiful woman appears with whom the prince has had an affair.
Yeah.
He's Italian, and in Italy, they had this affair. They were in love, and they couldn't marry because neither of them had any money. But she's come back. She is the childhood friend of his future wife. So that scene occurs with a great deal of impact. The prince is astonished, unsettled, to see her again.
Yeah.
And as in the Henry James novel, in The Prince, they go to buy a wedding gift together for his future bride, who is her old friend. And that now in Henry James, he used something called a golden bowl, which was really a crystal bowl with a gold finish. Mm-hmm. And in my novel, I used another device. I can't answer why. I'd like to understand why, but at some point I'll understand. There is a tiny or a small glass device or glass, how to put it, vase-like entity that is often found in Roman ruins. And it's called, to use a Latin name, lacrimarium, a lacrimarium, from to cry, lacrimose, and that's derived from Latin. This little vessel, which is about the size of I'm making it here.
Yeah. That
little vessel was used to catch the tears of mourners.
Aww.
in funerals, and they're found in burial sites. So I wanted something of my own, another thing. So I chose this. It's an antiquity. They go to this little shop that sells antiquities. They look at it and it has a crack. And the prince doesn't want her to buy it. This woman, who's called Christina in my novel, because it has a crack, and he thinks it's going to be bad luck. And in my view, he sees in this crack the possible problem or darkness in his forthcoming marriage, remembering he thinks he loves his future wife. So they don't buy the bowl. So I borrowed I made a wedding scene in my novel. Henry James doesn't have one. And I added a thing, remembering this is contemporary New York. Yeah. This family owns its own private island in Long Island Sound. Largest private island in Long Island Sound, which is off the coast of Long Island. And there is an island, such an island, that had belonged to a very wealthy family in real life. And I had actually been on that island. So I took that island and made it part of the background for this novel. A lot of the novel takes place where they go in the summer. And so I added that to my, my novel. I was very interested in what it would be like to have a huge private island off the most expensive real estate, at least in this country. And so in The Prince, this beautiful former mistress appears at the island. And part of this, one thing I borrowed from Henry James was that the character, the girl, is very close to her father. He's a widower, and she is afraid of leaving him alone when she marries. As she begins to feel that there's a problem with her husband and her girlfriend, but she's not sure, and this is key to the novel, because it's how recognition comes upon her, and believe me, she doesn't want to face it. And she thinks she's crazy at first. It can't be. Certainly they don't carry on right in front of her eyes, but she feels the tension in the air. So she arranges a marriage between her father and her girlfriend. And this creates tremendous issues. The father loves the girlfriend. Why is he agreeing to this? Because the girlfriend's much younger. And what is going on? So the trajectory of this novel is her growing awareness of what's happening, that her husband, whom she adores, is having an affair with her old girlfriend. And also, some of it is the father, because how much does he know? We're never quite sure, because the marvelous thing about Henry James, and I hope I got a little of it in here, is that much of the action, it's rarely spoken out loud. Nobody says, "You're having an affair with my old girlfriend," or the father doesn't say, "What? My son-in-law is having an affair with my wife?" All of it is unspoken. It's felt, it's acted upon. And the solution at the end of the novel is almost monstrous. I'd rather not give the end away. I can assure you it's not a murder, but it's psychologically monstrous. And all that part is borrowed from James. There's a character who's a kind of a busybody in James, and I made her into the art advisor of the wealthy father. He is building a museum, which is not uncommon in this country for people from this old wealth. They buy art. The Vanderbilt family created the Museum of Modern Art, or a descendant of the original Vanderbilt. It's as if to elevate themselves from these rather crude, tough progenitors of their wealth. Now they're going to be collecting art. So his art advisor, I made this busybody in the James novel. In The Prince, she becomes an art advisor.
This sounds really interesting.
I hope so.
Yeah, so like you said, this whole thing about wealth and the story just seems to be fueled by desire and power and money, and there seem to be themes of complexities of relationships. So I just want to ask you if you usually gravitate towards these themes, or was this fresh terrain for you?
This was totally fresh. My other novels, each one is entirely different from the other. My first novel took place in the 1970s, and it was about the student radicals in the US who wanted to change the world, and some of them were well off, that is true, but not all. They were middle class, upper class kids who did things like go to Detroit, the center of the automobile industry, and try to be a worker, try to organize the workers. It's about, and then a character who's a journalist and how he deals with his old friend doing this. The second novel was a sort of domestic novel about a stepbrother and stepsister who knew each other as children, are separated by circumstance, by the difficulties of their parents' marriages, and they come together. That was taking place in New York. My third novel was about a transgendered person in the Midwest, a young woman posing as a boy who goes to this little town, in a very bleak little town in Nebraska, or like Nebraska. Actually, it takes place in upstate New York because it's based on a real event. And he goes to this town, and all the girls, the teenage girls, fall in love with him.
Yeah.
Either not acknowledging or not realizing that he is actually a she. Then my last novel before The Prince was a biographical novel about the British author George Eliot, who married a man much younger. So every novel is very different. And the good part of it for me is exploring new worlds.
Yeah. So now to come away from your book and onto your writing process, do you have a strict one? Do you go with the flow? Can you talk about how?
A strict what? I'm sorry.
Do you have a strict writing process, or do you go with the flow? What is,
Yes. Well, I always write in the morning when I'm writing a novel. I find I have to be relieved in the afternoon because it's so painful. There are novelists who write into the night, and I so envy them. I'm afraid I can't, because I find it very difficult. So the beginning of the novel is often an image. To say this novel, The Prince, it comes from an image, isn't quite true. It came from what we call a miasma. I love being in the world of Henry James, its mysteries, its unspokenness, so that it was the only novel that really came out of that. Prior to that, the George Eliot novel, the crisis of her marriage occurred in Venice. So I had a picture of old Venice in my head, of her honeymoon. The novel's called A Honeymoon.
Yeah. Here,
again, it was like being cloaked in this strange silence. I do enjoy the settings for James's novels, because often they're not always, very rarely in America, but they're often in these grand palaces and country houses, which are fun to write about and they're totally shielded from reality, in those places. So that would be, I start with an image, and then in the case of Henry James and the Prince, Henry James gave me a structure that I could take and discard. So that was a useful thing. But I don't know if you know the Golden Bowl, it is immensely difficult. So I spent many hours trying to figure out what he was doing, where he was. But I read that novel, Henry James, almost as poetry, where you don't really analyze every word. You take away the inference of a word that stands out. But again, it was very important to me not to write it like that in The Prince.
Yeah. Right. So you kind of actually answered my next question. I was going to ask you what the source of your books is, people, books, conversations, but you did say that your books begin from an image. So I'm
I can talk about that though, because the first novel came from my own experience. In that period in the 70s, some of my friends were going off to organize in the civil rights movement, to protest against the war. And I was a journalist, which is looking at them. When you're a journalist, you're looking at them. And I remember, I don't know if you recall the Columbia University strikes of 1968. And it was almost at that moment where I realized I didn't want to be outside anymore. And so the first novel is about a journalist outside the action whose childhood friend or college friend goes, and he's in it. So in a way, it was from my struggle. And then the second novel was somewhat derived from my own childhood, where I had a stepbrother whom, because of the nature of our parents' marriages, I didn't see for 30 years. I tried to imagine what would come of seeing him. I wrote this novel before I actually saw him again. So I was trying to imagine. I was haunted by this boy, my childhood friend. The third novel came from a newspaper account of a real case. You may know the movie Boys Don't Cry. Yeah. Have you seen that? Yes, it came from, I was fascinated by the notion of how gender is presented. Yeah. And also, again, blind love, which is also what's happening in The Prince. George Eliot was always my literary heroine, and her second marriage was to this much younger man, and I knew that they went to Venice for their honeymoon, and he tried to kill himself. He was rescued, and I always wondered, why did he try to do that? Nobody knew, so I made up a reason. So those are the antecedents of my novels.
That's great. So, okay, so I just wanted to ask you an alternative question. Is it easier for you to write your beginnings, or is it more difficult to end books?
You know something, I think it's harder to end them because, for example, if you start out with an idea, as I did in The Prince, what's behind this story? What's the nature of this blindness? How do they get away with this blindness? Do they have to pay the price? So I had James to start me off.
Yeah.
In this case, The Prince, the ending wasn't so difficult because I ended it with the same theme as James, not the same sentence or the same, actually, very little is the same, but with the same notion. And I knew I had to get there in my novel. Whereas in other novels, I'm trying to think back, maybe the first and second novels, I had to find the ending, and it's hard. You know, sometimes you know where you have to go, you know how you're going to get there, or you don't know how you're going to get there.
Okay, so we can't have an interview with you and not talk about your prodigious filmmaking. So is writing just an alternative form of storytelling for you, or do you choose different mediums for different stories?
No, I have not. I was pretty successful as a filmmaker.
Yeah.
There have always been women in film in America, but there was a decline, really. And I came in a sort of second wave where there was an interest in women in film.
Yeah.
But I wanted to tell stories, you're right. And film is a very collaborative medium.
Yeah.
If you've been on a film set, there can be 500 or 600 people involved in the film, and on the set there can be 100. Everybody puts in some of their own vision, one way or another, the production designer, the makeup artist. I didn't want that collaborative structure. I felt that it would be easier for me just to tell the story myself without that. That was a big part. Secondly, at the time I was doing film, I was the second woman to have a film in the New York Film Festival. But at the time I was doing it, I couldn't look above me to many women who had done this.
Yeah.
In my case, I had a family, I had children, and there were very few role models that I could look at. By the way, that was also somewhat true in fiction writing, but less complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
As a writer, I had small children. You can take care of them at home, but if as a filmmaker, you have to travel.
Yeah.
You have to go to sets, you have to raise money. And I, in this case, had to prioritize raising my children. Although now many of the the women filmmakers have children, but at that point they didn't.
Right. But as an artistic process, does your filmmaking affect your writing and vice versa?
Yes, I love setting scenes.
Yeah.
I love working in images. I enjoy that. I think it should be that. I feel the reader wants to enter into this world and they want to experience it viscerally. So that's the way I write. There are some contemporary writers who write almost in, a paragraph here, a paragraph there. A lot of the novel takes place in their consciousness rather than in action. By the way, in Henry James, in The Golden Bowl, a lot of the novel takes place in the consciousness of the characters. Whereas one of the things I did do was make it come out into the world, the story. It became one of gestures, of scenes, of backgrounds,
That's great. And we're coming to our second last question. So just to end on a light note, if you ever had to write a spin-off about your favorite side character from The Prince, who would it be and why?
A spin-off of my favorite, what?
Side character, someone who isn't the protagonist.
Oh, I see. A character in my novel, in The Prince, who hasn't got his or her own novel.
Yeah.
Well, as I said, there's this character who's an art advisor. And she might be fun to write about because she's caught in between morally. She knows about this affair and she's close to this family and she doesn't tell them what she knows. She feels guilty. And it's interesting to figure out how this character in The Prince might have her own novel, which would be about knowing something and being guilty about it. That would be in this novel possible. There are a number of possibilities in every novel. I always write a little biography of my characters. Things that never appear in the novel, like where they went to college, where they were born, how they were brought up, just a few paragraphs.
Also, I just wanted to ask a random question that isn't in my list. When you finish writing a novel, do you just snap out of it or do you keep inhabiting that world for a while after it's done too?
I think so. In my view, a novel isn't quite finished until, first of all, you give it to your agent. Your agent has suggestions. Then perhaps a couple months later, she sold it and you have an editor who wants changes. So at night, when I'm trying to go to sleep, I'm writing. And that's not good because it gives me insomnia. And once I put my head on the pillow and I start that writing, I know I'm in for a long, terrible night of not being able to sleep. So the answer to your question is not really. And right now, when you're publishing a novel, as I am now, you're thinking about it again. So I think it goes on for a while.
Right. And finally, what is something that you'd really like to say to our viewers? Any message that you have, any advice, anything? Absolutely.
My advice to writers?
To writers, readers, everyone who's watching you right now.
I think, my advice to writers would be to follow your impulse. Try not to think about other writers. everybody has a story to tell, everybody. And there is a story within you. The question would be, can you bring it out into the world? You may not want to, but I think we should all be aware that we do have a story in us. We're natural. Human beings are natural storytellers. It begins when our parents tell us stories when we're little, and we tell a story every day to a friend or a family member. You won't believe what happened to me in the park today. I saw this dog and he was running away and I ran after the dog, and that's a story. So every day we tell stories, and it's a very human, it's perhaps one of the most significant human attributes. To my knowledge, animals don't, or other mammals don't tell stories. So we're both bipeds. We walk on two legs, and we're storytellers. And that distinguishes the humans from other animals who have other forms of intelligence that we don't have. So
that is such a great note to end this interview on. Thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it. And you were a joy and a wonder to talk to. Thank you so much.
You too. And okay, are we leaving this now? Are we cutting off?
I'm going to stop the recording. We can stay later if we want.
Just